Barely 22, she was handed to a stranger to cover her uncle's freight debt. The bill of lading had her name on it. I'd seen a lot of strange things in 22 years on the freight road: a coffin full of whiskey, a crate of live rattlesnakes somebody thought they could sell to a circus, a Methodist pastor who turned out to have 3 wives in different territories. I thought I'd stop being surprised. Then Arlo Peck walked into my camp at Sulphur Fork and slid that paper across the tailgate of my wagon like he was signing over a mule. "That's what Denton owes you," he said. "Hector Denton, my brother-in-law." I looked at the paper. $63.40 in unpaid freight charges, plus storage, plus what I'd spent on spoiled goods that had sat in my yard 2 weeks waiting for a man who never came to collect them. The paper said all of it was satisfied by delivery of one Ellie Denton, age 22, niece of the debtor, who had agreed to the arrangement and would travel with Caleb Rourke, that's me, to Laramie, where she would enter domestic service at the Tanner household, whose mistress had already been contacted and had agreed to take her on. I read it twice, then I said, "Where is she?" Arlo Peck pointed to the tree line about 40 yards off, where a young woman was standing with a canvas bag at her feet, looking at nothing in particular. She was wearing a gray dress and a hat that had seen better years. She wasn't looking at me. I folded the paper and put it in my coat pocket. "She agreed to this," I said. "It wasn't really a question." "She signed it," Arlo said, "right there at the bottom." I knew what that meant. It meant she'd had no better choice. A girl of 22 whose uncle had run through his credit and his goodwill and probably his dignity doesn't have a lot of options in a place like Sulphur Fork. She could sign, or she could stay and be a burden to a family that clearly didn't want her. I'd seen that arithmetic before. "All right," I said, "I leave at first light." Arlo nodded and walked back toward town without another word. I noticed he didn't say goodbye to her. I walked over to the tree line. She watched me come, and she didn't move, and I noticed her hands were very still at her sides, the way a person holds themselves when they're ready for something bad to happen, and they've decided not to flinch from it. I stopped about 6 feet away. "Miss Denton," I said, "I'm Caleb Rourke. I run freight between here and Laramie. The trip is about 12 days if the weather holds. You'll sleep in the wagon under the tarp or beside a fire. I'll handle the fire. I'll provide food. You don't owe me anything else and I don't expect anything else. We clear on that?" She looked at me. She had dark eyes, dark brows, a face that might have been softer if she'd had a few more years of rest and a few less years of Hector Denton. She was trying to figure out if I meant it. "Yes," she said. "Good, first light." I went back to my wagon and didn't look at her again that night. I had 2 horses and a mule that year. The mule was named Patterson, after a man I'd once had a disagreement with in Cheyenne, and like that man he was stubborn, reliable, and bad-tempered before noon. The horses were Sadie and a gray gelding I just called Gray, which is the kind of name you give a horse when you don't plan on getting attached to it, and then somehow keep the horse for 8 years. She was up before me. I came out of my bedroll at 4:15 and she was already sitting on the wagon step with her bag between her feet, watching the east go gray. I didn't say anything. I built the fire back up, put water on for coffee, started on the salt pork. She stayed where she was. When I put a cup beside her, she looked at it and then at me. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it." That was about all we said for the first 2 days. It wasn't unfriendly. She was watching me, the way you watch a situation you haven't figured out yet. And I was watching the road, which was what I got paid for. The stretch between Sulphur Fork and the Powder River crossing was good country for ambush. Not because of Indians anymore, we'd moved past that ugliness by then, but because of men who knew freight wagons carried payroll sometimes, and who were willing to do bad work for easy money. I had a Remington rolling block under the seat and a short-barrel Colt on my hip, and I'd been doing this long enough to know the difference between dust that meant weather and dust that meant riders. On the third morning she came up beside the wagon while I was checking Patterson's left foreleg, which had been bothering him on the rocks, and she crouched down without asking and ran her hand along the tendon. "He's sore but he's not damaged," she said. I looked at her. "My uncle had horses," she said, "before he lost those two." I said, "You know stock?" "Some." "Then you can help me watch him. Let me know if he starts favoring it worse." She nodded and stood and went back to her place in the wagon, but something had shifted. She'd offered a useful thing, and I'd taken it like it was a useful thing, and that was a transaction between two people who were on the same road together, not a man managing cargo. I think that was the first time she started to relax, even a little. We were 4 days out when we hit trouble. Not riders' weather. A front came in off the mountains faster than I'd seen one move in years, and by the time I got the canvas sheeted tight and the animals staked it was already snowing sideways, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an hour. There was a ravine cut into the hillside about a quarter mile off the road. I'd camped there twice before. Good windbreak, flat floor, spring that probably still ran under the ice. I got the rig down into it before dark. It was close quarters with the animals and the wagon and the two of us, but it was out of the wind. I built the fire against the rock face and got it hot. She helped without being asked, found the dry wood I had wrapped under the tarp, laid it right. When I looked up, she was watching the fire with her hands spread toward it, and her face in the firelight was younger than it looked in daylight. 22. I was 47. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. "Hauling freight. Being alone." I thought about that. "Long time," I said. "Don't you want something else?" I picked up a stick and poked the fire. "I had something else," I said. "Wife, piece of land up near Miles City, she died. Land went to the bank." I wasn't looking at her. "That was 11 years ago." I went back to the road. She was quiet a moment, then, "I'm sorry." "It's the past," I said, which was true and also not the whole truth, but I didn't owe her the whole truth on 4 days' acquaintance. She said, "My mother died when I was 14. My uncle took me in." A pause. "He was kind enough at first. Then the drinking got bad. Then the money got worse. And then he signed that paper." She looked at the fire, not at me. "I'm not angry. I thought it would be different. At 22, I thought I would have something of my own by now." I didn't have anything useful to say to that, so I said, "You still might." She looked at me then. I don't know exactly what she was looking for, but she didn't look away. The storm ran 2 days. We stayed in the ravine and waited it out. I fed the animals and she cooked, better than I did, which isn't saying much, and at night we sat on opposite sides of the fire and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. I learned that her mother had been a school teacher in Ohio before she came west. I learned that Ellie Denton could read and cipher and had opinions about things that most men I knew couldn't have formed a sentence about. I learned that she laughed at things that surprised me, quick and real, and went quiet again fast, like she'd learned to keep it from taking up too much space. On the second night of the storm she said, "You never asked me what I wanted." I looked up. "When you walked over to the tree line," she said, "you told me what you'd do and what you wouldn't do. But you never asked me what I wanted out of this." She was right, I hadn't. "What do you want?" I said. She thought about it. "To get to Laramie and have a roof and earn my own wages and not be handed to the next man in line when the first one doesn't need me anymore." She said it flat, not bitter, just as a fact. "That's all." "All right," I said. "You don't have anything to say about it?" "No," I said. "Those are reasonable things to want." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Good night, Mr. Rourke," and rolled herself in her blanket and went asleep. I sat up another hour feeding the fire and watching the snow pile up on the ravine lip above us, and I thought about the bill of lading in my coat pocket with her name on it, and I thought that was probably the worst piece of paper I'd ever been handed, and also that I intended to tear it up before we reached Laramie, and she could decide for herself whether she wanted the Tanner household or something else, and it was none of my business either way. We broke camp on the 5th day, the storm gone, the sky that particular scrubbed blue you only get after a hard blow in the high country. Everything was white and still, and the light off the snow was enough to make your eyes water. The road was rough going for the first few hours, drifts across the track, ice under the top crust where the sun hadn't hit yet. I walked Patterson through the worst of it while she held the reins on the wagon. She did it right, kept Gray and Sadie calm when they wanted to spook at the creaking ice, talked to them in a low, steady voice that worked better than anything I could have done from the ground. Around mid-morning, we came to the Powder River crossing. The river was up from snowmelt and running fast and gray. The ford I normally used was under 3 feet of water that looked deeper than it probably was, which is the worst kind of river to cross. I stood on the bank and looked at it for a while. "We can go upstream," I said, "about 4 miles. There's a footbridge, not wide enough for the wagon." "What does that mean?" "Means we unload, carry everything across on our backs and the mule, float the empty wagon, reload on the far side." I looked at the river. Half a day's work, maybe more. She climbed down from the wagon and stood beside me looking at the water. "Or we cross here," she said. "River's up. You've crossed worse." I had, in fact, crossed that same ford in spring runoff once, years back, with a heavier load. I'd lost 2 crates of hardware off the back end, and Patterson had nearly gone down, and I'd sworn to myself I'd never do it again. I looked at her. "You're not scared of it," I said. "I didn't say that," she said. "I'm asking if you've done it before." "Once," I said. "Didn't enjoy it." "But you got across." "I got across." She looked at the river another moment. Then she said, "Your call, Mr. Rourke." I thought about 4 miles upstream and half a day of carrying, and the weather that might be building again to the west. I thought about the Powder River in spring, which was mean and quick and didn't care what you intended. "We'll cross here," I said. "You ride up top, hold the tarp down on the high side. If the wagon goes, I want you in the water, not under it, you understand me. You swim for the near bank, not the far one." "All right." "I mean it, Miss Denton." "I heard you, Mr. Rourke." I lashed the load tight and we went in. It was bad. It was cold and fast, and the bottom shifted under the wheels twice, and there was a moment about 2/3 of the way across where Patterson went down on one knee, and the whole rig lurched sideways, and I was in water to my chest fighting to keep him up, yelling at Gray to push, and I could hear her above me doing something, not screaming, not freezing, doing something with the reins, pulling up on the near side to counterbalance. And somehow Patterson found his feet again, and we came out on the far bank in a rush of muddy water and the wagon intact. I stood in the shallows gasping. Everything hurt. My left shoulder had taken the pull of Patterson's lead when he went down, and it felt like something in there was unhappy about it. I was soaked through in 30-degree air. She was down off the wagon before it stopped rolling, and she was in front of me with her hands on my face before I'd even straightened up. "Are you hurt?" she said. "Shoulder," I said. "I'm all right." She had my coat half off before I could stop her, and her hands were on my shoulder, pressing and rotating, and it hurt enough that I made a sound I wasn't proud of, but she didn't stop. She worked the joint through its range and told me to lift my arm and push against her hand and tell her where it hurt. "Nothing's separated," she said. "It's the muscle, you'll be stiff." "I'll be fine," I said. "Yes, you will," she said, "because I'm going to wrap it tonight and you're not going to haul on that lead rope for the rest of today. I'll walk Patterson." I looked at her. Her dress was soaked from the knee down, and her hat was gone, somewhere in the river, and she had mud on her cheek, and she was looking at me like the argument was already over. "You don't have to do that," I said. "I know I don't," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." She walked Patterson for 4 hours that afternoon without complaining about it once. And that evening when we camped, she unwrapped a length of cotton batting from somewhere in her bag and wrapped my shoulder the way a person wraps it when they've wrapped shoulders before, firm and right. And her hands were steady and careful and close, and I sat very still and let her do it. When she was done, she didn't move right away. She had one hand still against my shoulder, and she was looking at her own hands, and then she looked up at me. Neither of us said anything. I said, "Ellie." First time I'd used her name, she noticed. "Yes," she said. "That paper Arlo Peck had you sign," I said. "I'm going to tear it up before we get to Laramie. The Tanner household or anything else, that's your call, not mine. Far as I'm concerned, you've more than paid whatever your uncle owed." She sat back on her heels and looked at me. "You decided that when?" she said. "Second night of the storm," I said. "Maybe before." She was quiet a long moment. The fire was low, and the stars were coming up sharp the way they do at elevation after a clear day, and the only sound was the horses moving on the picket line, and Patterson grinding his teeth on a stalk of dried grass. "And what do you get," she said, "out of tearing it up?" "Nothing," I said. "That's not why I'm doing it." She looked at me for a long time with those dark eyes. "You're not like I expected," she said, "when Arlo Peck pointed at you." "What did you expect?" "I don't know, something worse." She looked at the fire. "I've spent 8 years waiting for something worse." I didn't say anything to that. "I'd like to keep going with you," she said. "Past Laramie, I mean, however far you're going. If that's something you'd consider." She said it carefully, like she was measuring each word before she spent it. "I'm useful. You've seen that. I can cook and I know stock and I don't complain. And I'd rather earn my place on this road than sweep some woman's floors in a town I've never seen." She stopped. She was looking at her hands again. "I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give," she said. "I just want to be clear about what I'm offering." I sat with that for a minute. There are moments in a man's life, not many of them, where something is offered that he knows, right down to the ground, is more than he deserves, not because he's done something wrong, but because he's been running a long time on empty, and he'd stopped thinking the tank would ever fill again. And then somebody hands you something real and warm and freely given, and you have to decide whether you're going to take it or talk yourself out of it. I had talked myself out of things before. I was good at it. "Past Laramie's a long road," I said. "I know," she said. "Rough country, weather like this half the year." "I've noticed," she said, and there was the laugh, quick, real, gone fast. "You'd want wages," I said. "Fair ones, not favors." She looked up at me. "Yes." "Then we'll work that out," I said, "properly." She held still for a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand against the side of my face. Not a soft thing, not a trembling thing, just a steady hand and a pair of dark eyes that were looking at me without any armor in them, which was something I hadn't seen in a very long time. "All right, Caleb," she said. First time she'd used my name. I put my hand over hers and held it there. We made Laramie on the 12th day, the shoulder mostly healed, the road behind us dry and cold and ours. I tore the bill of lading up at the edge of town and let the pieces go in the wind coming off the Laramie range, and she watched them go without any expression I could read, and then she turned to me and said, "Where next?" I had a load of mining equipment contracted for Rawlins. Then I had nothing scheduled past that, which was unusual for me. I usually ran tight, contract to contract, no slack. "Rawlins first," I said, "then we'll see." She nodded and climbed back up to the wagon seat and gathered the reins, and I walked around and got up beside her, and we went into Laramie side by side in the thin winter light, the mountains behind us still carrying last week's snow on their shoulders, and Patterson grinding away at something he'd found on the road, and the whole of the territory still open ahead. I didn't have words for what had shifted between us. I'm not sure I needed them. She was there, and she'd chosen to be there, and that was the thing I hadn't known I was still waiting for until she gave it to me. A good woman freely choosing. That's not nothing at all.